Welcome back to the channel, and I appreciate you tuning in to the stuff that I put on the internet here. So today's video is going to be going over resensitization and maintenance phases and kind of generally programming for bodybuilding and a few things to focus on, because I think that a lot of people kind of don't really understand when to use these phases and what they're kind of for, when it makes sense to. So this is going to kind of be the main topic of today's video, and then I'm going to wrap up with some kind of frequently asked questions about these phases, all right? So the very first thing that I want to discuss here, after this nice little animation plays, okay, I got to click it again, is a few of the biggest principles that you just need to consider in general when creating a program. And if you have these three principles in mind when creating programs, you can create so many different programs based on someone's goals and their lifestyle and all these different things. As long as you keep these three main principles in mind, like there's other principles, of course, that I didn't include here, but these are the three biggest ones to consider. And number one, and this is the most important principle, is specificity. Making sure that your program or the program that you are creating is specific to the goals of whoever is going to be implementing that program. So what do I mean by this? If my goal is to grow my upper body, that's all I kind of care about, which isn't too far from my goals. Like, I care a little bit about my lower body, but not that much. So it is what it is. But if that's my goal, so hypertrophy, and then specifically hypertrophy of the upper body, well, my program should be specifically tailored to that. And the stress that my program induces should largely be allocated towards growing my upper body, because we only have so much stress that we can handle, or so much stimulus that we can benefit from. And if I'm allocating some of my stress budget towards other things other than my goal, then I'm probably just not going to get to my goal as quickly or at all. For example, if that is my goal and I spend a ton of time training my legs for strength and doing powerlifting type training for my legs, then I'm allocating a large portion of stress away from my true goal, which is probably going to result in worse results. This is something that I totally messed up when I first started training. I would try to combine powerlifting, bodybuilding, and do some Olympic lifts as well because I thought they were cool. I had such a hard time picking one goal and realizing what's important to me, because I'd see this guy on Instagram doing some hang cleans, and I'd see this guy with huge biceps, and I'd see this other guy with a monster squat. And I'd be like, yeah, I could do all those. And I can't. Maybe you can, but I think that a lot of people are like, hey, let's really focus in on one thing. Maybe there's some kind of side things that we can do as well that aren't totally violating this principle. But I really think that focusing in on what your actual goal is, what's really important to you. Like, for me, I've been training my legs hard since like middle school for football. Like, we always have done squats. We've always done like RDLs and leg movements and stuff like that. Like, for sports, our programs were definitely geared towards that. So I've been training my lower body pretty hard, pretty effectively with compound lifts for like a decade. So my lower body's pretty well developed. And, I was still allocating a ton of stress towards my lower body when I kind of came to the realization that, hey, I really don't care that much my lower body grows that much more. which kind of made me come to the realization that, hey, if I just kind of train around MEV for my lower body and allocate more stress to muscles that are more important to me, then I'm probably going to see better results, and I'm using my time more effectively, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of other things I want to do in this life than grow every muscle that I can to its maximum. So there's that opportunity cost of, I can do this, but what am I giving up to do this? And it's the same thing with specificity. Like, we only have so much stress that we can recover from. Make sure that you are allocating that stress toward your actual goals. All right? Now, is it okay if you have a couple secondary goals? Like, say your main goal is hypertrophy, but you still want to get stronger and that sort of thing? Yeah, I think that you're still going to get moderately strong training for hypertrophy. It's a nice little byproduct. But if you want to have maximal strength and stuff like that, then you're going to have to be a little bit more strategic in periodizing your program to have strength phases and bodybuilding phases, and not trying to kind of do everything at once and that sort of thing, all right? So key point number one is we want to make sure our program is specific. Number two, this is a pretty easy one. We want to make sure it's overloading. And we want to make sure that the stress that we are applying is probably progressively increasing in an absolute sense. So if we're lifting 135 pounds for 10 reps today, we might want to be doing a little bit more weight, a little bit more reps a few months from now. All right? That's a pretty easy one. I think that most of you are probably familiar with progressively doing a little bit more in the gym, so the stress that we're applying is still overloading and causing that adaptation that we're looking for. And then number three, fatigue management. Your program should have some sort of fatigue management. So you should be taking off days. You should probably be having phases to where you pull back on the training stress a little bit. So think deloads. And right along with this, resensitization phases, lower volume phases. These are all ways to manage fatigue. So if your program is specific to your goals, it has some form of progressive overload, and you're managing that stress, that fatigue in some way, then you're doing like that's kind of like the 20% that's going to get you the 80%, making sure that you have these in place, all right? So let's more specifically talk resensitization. So what is this? Basically, it's a low volume phase to where it has a couple of different purposes. And do I talk about purposes? Yeah, purpose of a resensitization phase. So that last slide, I don't think I really needed. All resensitization phases is a lower volume phase to where you bring that training stress down a little bit. Now, the purpose of a resensitization phase. Well, one, to resensitize. Okay, Ryan, no shit. But what I mean by this is, if we keep pushing hypertrophy phase after hypertrophy phase after hypertrophy phase, we might run into a position to where we are becoming a little bit more resistant to that adaptation. So there might be some, now a lot of this is speculation based on mechanistic research, and sometimes that doesn't always pan out to actually have any practical significance. But there is some rationale to think that, hey, maybe we would get a downregulation in some of these anabolic pathways if we keep doing high volume training for an extended period of time. We might just get a little bit kind of desensitized to that training stress. We might notice that, hey, we're not getting very good pumps anymore. We're not getting very strong, that sort of thing. We might see some of that desensitization. So one purpose is to see that resensitization effect by bringing that stress down. So when you come back to that stress, you're a little bit more sensitive to it. Also, managing fatigue, it's kind of like a macro cycle deload. So we have a single deload after like 4 to 6 weeks of training. Well, it's probably also a good idea to have a macro cycle deload after 4 to 6 mesocycles or months of training, as we probably accumulate some fatigue. Like a deload, it's great for dropping fatigue, but at some point it probably doesn't clear everything. Like we probably still accumulate little pains and little niggles, and different stressors probably accumulate up a little bit to where we don't kind of clear all of that, which is one single deload week, to where over several mesocycles, we might need to take a full kind of 3 to 5 week lower volume kind of deload or maintenance phase to drop that fatigue. And then also this third one, I would say this is less of a significant one for most people because we love to train. We usually don't like taking phases like this, but for some, it can be like a psychological release to not have to constantly push that hypertrophy training. And if you have stuff going on in your life, it can be a nice kind of release from just all that structure and having that training. Although, if you're like me, you kind of enjoy that sort of thing, all right? So, this brings me to, when does it make the most sense to use a resensitization phase? Well, when resensitization is needed. So, I'm going to give you a better answer to that, but that's kind of the foundation of it is, okay, we probably want a lower volume resensitization phase when we are feeling like we are desensitized to training. So, how do you know if you're starting to get kind of desensitized to your training? Well, there's no like easy way to tell, and it's kind of looking at proxies and just trying to kind of piece things together and figure things out. So, for one, if you notice that you are not getting as good of pumps anymore throughout your mesocycle, especially on a per unit of volume. So let's say that you usually do like 5 or 6 sets for your chest, and you notice that you get a really good pump from that, but then after a few mesocycles, it's taking 7 or 8 sets to get a really good pump, then you might be getting some of that desensitization there. Also, if you're noticing that it's taking more and more and more sets to get any sort of soreness or any sort of signs of kind of homeostatic disruption or fatigue, that's also a decent sign. So if it usually took you, 4 or 5 sets in a single session of chest to get some slight soreness, a little bit of fatigue the following day, but then after 3 or 4 mesocycles, it takes 6 or 7 sets to do that, and then it starts to take 8 or 9, then you're potentially running into a point where, okay, my pumps aren't as good for each unit of volume I'm doing. I'm not noticing as much kind of homeostatic disruption. Then you're probably looking at, okay, I could probably bring things down for a little bit, sensitize myself a little bit more. So those are some indicators I look for. Also, like strength, performance in the gym. If you're noticing that your performance is just totally kind of plateaued, and you're also noticing pumps, soreness, stuff like that are just kind of off, then this might be a good time, okay? Additionally, we might use one of these phases when fatigue management in particular is needed. So you finish a deload phase and you notice that you don't feel quite right. And every mesocycle, you're noticing that you get fatigued earlier and earlier in that mesocycle. So let's say that you start a macro cycle, so multiple mesocycles, and you feel pretty fresh, you feel good. But then after, let's say, 4 or 5 mesocycles or kind of months of training, depending on how you structure your mesocycle, you start to notice that I start getting fatigued a little bit sooner in my mesocycle. So maybe in those first couple mesocycles, you made it 5 or 6 weeks just fine, accumulating volume, and then you're progressing well and all that sort of thing. But then after 3 to 5 mesocycles, you notice that in week 3 or in week 4, you start feeling really fatigued and you almost start feeling overreached sooner in your mesocycle. That could be a good sign that each mesocycle that you're starting with a little bit more fatigue. So you're getting fatigued sooner in your mesocycle. That could be a good sign. Also, you can kind of tell if you enter a new mesocycle and you still have some fatigue after your deload. That might be a sign that, hey, we have some fatigue kind of overlapping here. We might need a full kind of phase of maintenance to drop that fatigue. All right. And I particularly like resensitization phases and lower volume phases of maintenance after an extended cutting phase, because I think that usually if you say you cut for like 10 to 15 weeks, that's kind of what I mean by extended, 10 to 20 weeks. You're probably at the point to where you're kind of run down a little bit, like you dieted for long enough to start feeling the effects of the diet. You're probably not feeling 100% in the gym yet. You're probably maybe a little bit hungry. You're just not quite right for really good performance in the gym. You're not like your peak massing phase feeling good, and you just have some diet fatigue and that sort of thing. Well, I really like placing a maintenance phase after this to, okay, let's clear up some of that hunger. Let's drop that training fatigue or any fatigue. And it could be like 3 or 4 weeks. That's all it has to be. And after these 3 or 4 weeks, you're going to notice that, okay, my fatigue is gone. I'm not like hungry and not feeling like frail in the gym and that sort of thing. Like I filled up my glycogen again in this phase. And I think that puts you at such a better spot to start your gaining phase. Then you can really start off on the right foot and have a much more productive start to your gaining phase. Okay, so I really like these after an extended cutting phase. Also, if you ever just need a psychological break, it can be beneficial. So let's say that you have a month coming up to where it's like going to be hectic. You're traveling, or you have a lot of exams, or you're switching careers, you're switching your job, or you just have a lot going on in this particular month. Well, rather than really worrying about trying to structure like super periodized training and pushing hypertrophy, hey, let's just take kind of a life primer phase here. Let's train like 3 days a week. Let's maintain. Let's treat it as a resensitization phase because it's probably going to have some benefits, and just kind of give you this a little bit of a break here. That can be a great time to use these. All right. So, some frequently asked questions. Do you need to deload after a resensitization phase? And I say yes. So here's how I would structure it. I would say, okay, you finish your mesocycle and you're like, after this mesocycle, I want to do a primer phase, a resensitization, a maintenance phase. I would take a deload, and then I would do 3 or 4 weeks of lower volume, and I'll touch on what your training should look like. I'll cover that right now. So the 2 final questions are like, what should training look like, and what should my training look like after? So throughout a resensitization or maintenance phase, I tend to like to keep rep ranges on the lower side. I like to stay out of any metabolic type work. So I don't want like us shooting to get really nice pumps and stuff like that. I want to sensitize ourselves to that style of training. So I keep things in that, usually that 5 to like 8 rep range on the compound lifts for the most part. And then on isolations, I'll kind of go 8 to 12 still, because like you can go like 7 to 10 on delts or something like that every once in a while, especially like upright rows and stuff. But some people, it just bothers their elbows and stuff like that. So I'm totally fine. Like if that bothers you, don't force yourself into doing a rep range that hurts your elbows and stuff like that. Like it's going to be fine. So on isolations, I'll kind of stay in that 7 to 12 rep range. All right. And then volume, I have volume at like 2/3 of what it usually is like week 1 of starting a mesocycle. And I stay that the whole time. So if you usually start a mesocycle, like your MEV, let's say your MEV is usually around like 10 sets, then throughout a maintenance phase, I'm probably just going to do like 6 or 7 sets per muscle per week. Because we could probably maintain on far less than that, but I keep it at about 60 to 70% of my week 1 volumes. So it's pretty low, and that should really allow you to bring that volume down and feel really good there. So volume and intensity there, so rep range. And then for relative intensity, I keep things similar. I still keep things within a few reps from failure. I still tend to do like 3 reps in reserve in week 1, and then a couple of reps in reserve for the next 2 weeks, and then 0 to 1 reps in reserve for the final week. So I still progress reps in reserve because sometimes it's fun to, like, in those lower rep ranges, shoot for some strength PRs and stuff like that. All right. So that's kind of what my training looks like, is like 60 to 70% of week 1 volumes, lower rep ranges, and relative intensity stays about the same. And I think that will do a good job. So we finish our mesocycle, we take a deload, then we have 3 to 4 weeks of resensitization. I think that you could probably just do 3. So deload, 3 weeks resensitization of maintenance, and then I like to do another deload at the end. And usually for that deload, I either just have people take a full week off, or it's like super light and a very easy week of training. And now the question is, what should your training look like when you come back? Ease into it, okay? So if you just did a mesocycle of like mostly 5 to 10 rep range and a lot lower volumes, come back in that first week doing like 1 set less per exercise that you would normally do in that week 1 of your first mesocycle. So if you usually do like, okay, in this first mesocycle, I usually do like 10 sets for my chest all week, and I do 5 in this first session, then I would do like 3 or 4, and I would really ease into it. So instead of having your week 1 be 10 sets of chest, I might have it be like 7 or 8. All right. And then rep range, if you just did, I would gradually scale that up as well. Like I wouldn't jump from, let's say you just did 4 to 6 reps on your bench, then I would move to 6 to 8 in this first mesocycle. I probably wouldn't go, or 6 to 10, somewhere in there. I probably wouldn't just jump to 10 to 15 right away and totally change that rep range just kind of off the bat. All right. So gradually work back into your volume a little bit less than what it was previously. Like, so if the resensitization phase was like 60%, then in that first week back, you might do like 80% of what your normal week 1 usually looked like. And especially being careful on those exercises that are more fatiguing. So RDLs and lunges, stuff like that, maybe you just start with 1 set in that first session back. All right, so gradually ease into it. And the final question I'll touch on here is, if you feel fine, do you have to take one? Like, do you just arbitrarily have to take one of these phases every 5 or 6 weeks or 5 or 6 months? I say no. I don't program these phases unless indicators from clients or myself are telling me that, hey, progress seems to be slowing down here. It seems like we're getting less of a stimulus for per unit of volume based on their performance, their pumps, their soreness, and they're reporting, after deload, they don't feel quite right. That's when I use them. Or after a cutting phase, I will just kind of place it there because usually there's signs of that fatigue. But if you're massing and you've been massing for 6 months and you still feel fine and you're progressing really well, your pumps are good, your volume hasn't changed that much, I would keep going. Ride that momentum, keep it going. I don't use these unless I'm seeing some of these indicators. Okay? So that's resensitization phases. I hope this helps. If you like videos like this, let me know, and I'll see you in that next one. All right. See you guys.